welcome. Good to see you. My name's Darren Dochuk with David Lantigua. I'm co-director of the Cushwa Center in the Department of History here as well, so welcome. And it's really wonderful for us today to have so many visitors to the Dolan Seminar, many for first time. We've got guests from as far away as Massachusetts, Florida, and California, and of course, central Indiana. We welcome those usuals from Indianapolis and the area. A special welcome to Luca Codignola, chair of Cushwa's Rome Advisory Committee, who's made the trip here from Italy, a longtime friend of the center. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to host you on this beautiful spring, typically beautiful spring weekend here at Notre Dame. Thank you to Shane Ulbrich and Madonna Noak as well for taking care of logistics to make this all possible as usual. So welcome. Twice each year, the Dolan Seminar in American Religion provides historians of North American religion and other interested scholars an opportunity to discuss a notable recent book published in the field. The topic of our seminar today is Stephen Koeth's book, CRABGRASS Catholicism, How Suburbanization Transformed Faith and Politics in Post-War America, published just late last year by the University of Chicago Press. And it's my pleasure to welcome and congratulate Stephen, my colleague, and also to welcome our panelists for this morning, and I'll just briefly introduce them at this point. First of all, the star of the show, Father Stephen Koeth, is assistant professor of history here at Notre Dame, where he is also faculty co-director of the Church Properties Initiative in the Fitzgerald Institute, as well as a priest in residence at Stanford Hall. A member of the Congress of Holy Cross, Father Stephen earned both a BA in history and a Master's of Divinity degree here at Notre Dame, as well as an MA in history from the Catholic University of America. He received his PhD at Columbia University, where his dissertation won the university's Bancroft Award for Best Dissertation. He has also won from the Catholic Historical Association the John Tracy Ellis Dissertation Award. Father Stephen specializes in the urban, religious, and political history of 20th century America. His research focuses on U.S. Catholic involvement in post-war metropolitan development, including urban renewal projects, public housing, and suburbanization, and the effects of those interactions on Catholic faith and politics. His scholarship has been published in the Journal of Church and State, U.S. Catholic Historian, and American Catholic Studies, and his commentary has appeared in the Washington Post, the Washington Times, U.S. Catholic, and even on BBC Radio 4. Incidentally, he's also great at designing a website, so feel free to check out www.crabgrasscatholicism.com. He insists it's strictly for information, not self-promotion. Before joining the faculty at Notre Dame, he was a postdoctoral fellow of the Cushwa Center for 2 years. Father Stephen is no stranger to the Dolan Seminar, but we're excited to welcome you back today. Thank you. We're also fortunate to have three excellent commentators to get the discussion started this morning, and they will spend the first part of our session here offering their comments, to which Stephen will respond. Michelle Nickerson, Paige Glotzer, and Father Sean Dempsey. Father Sean Dempsey is a Jesuit priest of the California province and associate professor and chair of history at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He received a BA in English literature here at Notre Dame and an MA in American Studies from St. Louis University, as well as an MDiv from the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. He completed his doctoral studies in history at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the historical intersection of religion, social thought, and urban politics in the 20th century. His book, excellent book, I had the privilege of reviewing, City of Dignity, Christianity, Liberalism, and the Making of Global Los Angeles, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2023. It explores the role of liberal Protestants and Catholics in shaping the progressive ethics of post-war Los Angeles. Father Sean, welcome back to Notre Dame. Paige Glotzer is Associate Professor of History at the University of Florida. She received her PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University. She previously held the John W. and Jean M. Rose Chair in the History of American Politics, Institutions, and Political Economy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison before moving to Florida just a couple of years ago. Before that, she held a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard's Joint Center for History and Economics. Her first book, How the Suburbs Were Segregated, Developers and the Business of Exclusionary Housing, 1890 to 1960, published by Columbia University Press, received the Kenneth Jackson Award for Best Book in North American History and the Lewis Mumford Award for Best Book in American City and Regional Planning History. Paige's current book project, titled Transnational Peripheries, Rethinking Suburbs in the U.S. and Latin America, focuses on the interactions between American realtors and Latin American consumers from the mid-20th century to the present. Her work has been featured in several academic and popular outlets, ranging from the Journal of Urban History and, I must add, Modern American History, to PBS and Time. So thank you for being with us, Paige. Michelle Nickerson is a professor of history at Loyola University in Chicago. She earned her PhD in American Studies from Yale University, and she teaches courses on the history of women and gender, U.S. politics, social movements, cities and suburbs, and American religion. In 2012, Michelle published Mothers of Conservatism, Women and the Post-War Right, which was published by Princeton University, and which documents the grassroots activism of conservative women in Cold War Los Angeles and explores the impact of that activism on the emerging American right. And she's also edited, with yours truly, Sunbelt Rising, The Politics of Place, Space, and Region, an edited volume published by the University Press, which was an instant classic, translated into 50 languages, and remains a bestseller. Michelle's latest book, Spiritual Radicals, How the Camden 28 Put the Vietnam War on Trial, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2024. It's like we have a contract with the University of Chicago or some kind of, but they've done well, obviously. Michelle has also held a Fulbright at the University of Heidelberg, and Michelle, great to have you back at Notre Dame. So for those of you who are new to the format, we're going to hear from each of our commentators for roughly 15 minutes, and then Father Stephen will take the podium and respond however he sees fit. And then we'll have probably about 15 minutes for coffee, and we'll come back and have a question and answer session with hopefully all the panelists. So feel free to jot some notes down and some questions, and we'll bring those back after the break. So first, Father Sean.
Well, thank you and good morning, everyone, and thank you for welcoming a prodigal son back. I graduated here in 1995, and the cognitive dissonance of being in the Morrison last night was something which the Morrison was sort of this ugly cinder block building when I lived just next door at Alumni for 4 years. So the transformation has been stunning. It's wonderful to be here. Congratulations, Stephen. This is really an incredible work of scholarship. But just to begin with a personal anecdote, it's finally happened to me, as I knew it probably would as a historian. I'm finally old enough to have lived some of the history that's narrated in this book. I am a native of the Diocese of Rockville Center myself. So as I'm reading the book and seeing, Bishop McGann, and he confirmed me. Wait a minute, I'm in this book. So congratulations. I can't underscore enough how much this book really is challenging, insightful, brilliantly researched, and to use a scholarly cliche, but I think it's incredibly true in the case of crabgrass Catholicism, fills or helps to start filling a massive gap in our scholarly knowledge, namely the effect of suburbanization on Catholicism and beginning a conversation on the effect of suburbanization in general on American religion. The field of scholarship on the suburbs is not brand new anymore, but certainly emphasis on religion and the role of religion, both in being informed by and informing the process of post-war suburbanization has been lacking. So as I was reading it, I paid it my highest internal mental compliment, which is, why didn't I think of this? So congratulations again. I was struck by many things, so I just want to sort of highlight some things that I think are especially exciting and provocative for us to think about. And I also have some observations that are certainly not criticisms in any traditional sense, but rather areas where we may choose to discuss a little further today, maybe give us some ideas for future scholarship, either Stephen's own or my own or people gathered in this room as well. The first thing that really struck me as something I had not thought of or known at all was kind of the strand of anti-urbanism in Catholic thought that Father Stephen highlights so well. In my own work, I've been very focused on Catholic urbanism, and there's a whole body of literature that I'm sure many here gathered are familiar with, Robert Orsi's work from a generation ago now, emphasizing almost the inherently urban character, especially of American Catholicism, and to see this sort of forgotten strand of Catholic thought drawn out so well, where the Catholic tradition is not simply one focused on urbanism or urban experience, but rather one that also privileges rural spaces, non-urban spaces. And that got me thinking about ways in which religious orders and the church itself for a long time were placing their institutions deliberately outside of cities for a long time, especially in the 19th and up to the mid part of the 20th century. So that was new for me. That was something that I had not done a lot of thinking about, and certainly will be challenging my own work on religious and Catholic urbanism going forward. Something else that really came out to me was the idea of the suburban home as kind of a new place of meeting the church, or especially for lay people to encounter the institutional church, and this transition in this Vatican II pre, during, and post-Vatican II world that's narrated so vividly in the text. How is this transforming the American church? Part of this is my own bias. I don't know about the CSCs or other religious orders, but we in the Jesuits often talk about, meeting people where they are, and going to the frontiers of the church in order to minister to the people of God. And I had never thought, honestly, about the suburban home as being a kind of frontier in that sense. In the post-World War II era, and also the kind of the triumphs and the pitfalls of those spaces, right? And we hear a lot about marriage encounter and various other movements that were not only sort of based in the suburban home or centered in the suburban home, but in a way are responses to these new spaces opening up. So I found that to be very, very provocative. The other thing is the focus on Catholic education. And I was just telling Father Stephen and some others last night at the reception, this idea of Catholic education having been so urban focused, and how does it reorient itself to suburban space? And I was actually someone growing up in the Diocese of Rockville Center where I was kind of far from the nearest Catholic high school. And I can remember discussions when I'm in about 7th or 8th grade in my family about whether and how we could send me to a Catholic high school. I wound up going to a public school. So the challenges of suburbanization, even for those families that sort of wanted to form their children in the Catholic intellectual tradition and send them to Catholic schools. And the last thing I'll say, I could go on all day. The last thing I'll say as far as highlights for me was the contribution of the Catholic Church in the suburbs to what scholars have variously called political realignment in the United States after World War II. Many scholars have focused, rightly, on the racial aspects of this political realignment in the post-World War II era. I think it's really exciting for us to dig down and think about, as Father Stephen has in this book, on the religious aspects of that realignment, the politics of home ownership, the contribution and suburbanites to the so-called culture wars in this period. That's something that's of great interest to me. Was this political realignment after World War II and kind of the split and the migration of Catholics out of the Democratic Party to a much more split group? What role did suburbanization and the suburban church play in that? Are really fascinating topics of conversation. And then just very quickly, because I don't want to take up too much time, some areas that I either had further questions about or would love to see another book about, or other scholars kind of tackle some of these questions. Because of the focus on the Diocese of Rockville Center, I found myself wondering about what about suburban spaces within dioceses that were not sort of erected specifically to be new suburban dioceses? And so even though I grew up in the Diocese of Rockville Center, there are certainly many parallels with the Diocese of Orange in California, which spun off of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. Those, to my mind, are two clear-cut dioceses that were erected as suburban dioceses. But what about the expanding suburbs in dioceses that either did not split or began to incorporate these new suburbs? What did their story look like? Another thing I wondered about was, and this is kind of coming from my own work, to kind of put the story of crabgrass Catholicism in conversation with what I see as kind of the persistence of a social gospel inflected urbanism, both in the Catholic Church and in many Protestant churches as well. Was it a complete split, or was there some sort of conversation between them or tension between those different groups? Those that remained living and working in urban centers as opposed to a suburbanizing church. Another thing that I kind of wondered about, and I think it's really a provocative question, is this idea that the Catholic Church sort of, and this comes from our own John McGreevy here, among others, the Catholic Church, by its institutional nature, tends to sort of shape neighborhoods and communities, right? We've looked at that a lot of ways in terms of cities. Was that true also in suburban spaces as well? Did the Catholic Church kind of help define? And I think Father Stephen would say yes, and I'm interested in kind of hearing more about that. And finally, and this is something that the book kind of leaves us on, is this grappling with, and I love especially love the last part of the book, kind of defining the history that's narrated here as the church grappling with a genuinely new era, not only of the reception of Vatican II, but the spatial elements of that in suburbanization, the ways in which the church is responding to and helping inform this very tumultuous kind of post-war period. And then to kind of link it up to the talk last night, is this yet another working out of the church's response to modernity, to capitalism, and how do you maintain a community of faith given the challenges of our own time. And so kind of taking this specific story of Rockville Center and bringing it up, as we Catholics like to do, to the universal and the cosmic. So, but once again, an absolute knockout of a book. I'll be thinking about it for a long time, and I think my next book will certainly be footnoting yours extensively. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you so much, Father Stephen. I loved reading this book, and it's given me also a lot to think about. And honestly, the first thing it made me think about was very personal, because the earliest Catholic churches in my life are mentioned in your book. So the first church I ever went into was St. Jude's in Canarsie in Brooklyn, which is mentioned here. And I remember some of the very features that you really emphasize. I remember the modernism of the architecture. I remember the parking lot, which in Brooklyn is something that stands out, that there was a big parking lot. And I also kind of think about how it was a bit of an early indicator, too, of the demographic changes that were going to come not long after some of my first memories of St. Jude's. Much of my neighborhood, Canarsie, including my own family, participated in white flight from Canarsie to the suburbs. And Canarsie is a majority Black neighborhood today. And it just kind of, I think it felt very urgent, kind of, when I read the book. Even though this is a work of history, that sense of urgency was very clear to me, that this is a topic that still needs to be kind of thought about, discussed. It's very much still part of people's lived experiences. Other aspects of the book also kind of rang home for me. I remembered, for instance, the names of the different churches that my teacher would call out as part of release time in elementary school. It's actually how I learned the names of all of the churches in the area, because my teacher would read them out as students would be dismissed early from school for religious instruction. So all this is to say that Father Stephen gifted us a deeply, deeply researched and highly original work of major scholarly significance. But he also reconstructed a world that feels very lived in the best way. And I think that's really a key to the success of CRABGRASS Catholicism, and why I think it will stick around as part of the conversation for a long time to come. I want to touch on a few things that stood out to me in terms of method, topics. I want to then also talk a little bit about maybe some future directions where kind of I think conversations could go. And then I want to raise a few questions, maybe that we can all discuss today. But I want to start with the kind of aspect of space and visibility. So as someone trained as an urban historian, I love the spatiality here, and that you kind of foregrounded space as a method. You really draw the kind of distinction between the urban and suburban parish as one that is spatial. For instance, in the urban parish, the church was always very visible. The church functions were visible. Clergy were visible. And everyone would have kind of encounters that created a type of community. And then I think what perhaps for me best encapsulated the difference, the contrast there, was your anecdote about the drive-in theater, the Mass at the drive-in theater. And how essentially the capacity needs of that church came at the cost of an air of sacredness to the experience of attending. And you used this example of this little girl who got lost on her way back from taking communion because she couldn't find the car where her family sat. And that contrast, essentially, between the aisles of a drive-in theater and the aisles of an urban church, or even in the kind of contrast there to the layout of a city street, right? Drive-in was not meant for walking. You drove, right? And you sat, and then you drove away. It wasn't a spatial form, and thus I think this is true maybe of suburbs in general. It wasn't a spatial form that could be intuitively navigated by a child. And its scale, the scale of suburbs created, and just like in that day in the theater, created a type of anxiety and frustration rather than a sense of the sublime or of community. And I think for this, Father Stephen argues, it was not inevitable. It actually wasn't even an inevitable component of suburbanization itself. And I think that you really balance that nicely with looking at how people took great pride in their modernist churches and their large parking lots, and how people, with kind of the sort of support of the church, tried to use the spaces of suburbs to create community, but there was always this spatial obstacle in the way to kind of replicating what made aspects of urban parishes so successful in generations past. But I think that as a historian too, your approach to space is layered with relationships. And not only relationships, technologies that I think also really help to mediate how people interacted with each other and with the church. So for instance, the drive-in theater didn't have the tech to actually make use of the screen. There were no images projected, right, of what was going on, as far as I understood it, just sound. So everybody was tiny and distant, but the sound was amplified. And yet suburbanites so often define themselves and the American dream through visuals, right? All of the magazines and photo spreads of the single-family home, of domestic life, of cars, of children. And so this all took place in the era of television rather than radio. And that also then shaped the imagination and shared kind of imagined community of what it meant to be suburbanites. So thinking about relationships in space, I want to kind of link the way that in this book we see space as part of an institutional history. The Diocese of Rockville Center was just huge. Like it just covered so many square miles. I was actually stunned when I saw the map. It was just so big. And that kind of spatial aspect, again, made me really appreciate the institutional story here. How this is a story about funding decisions, about the interpretation of mission and of doctrine at different organizational levels and from different individuals, all within the hierarchy of the church. There were networks. This is a network story. Who knew whom? Who was aligned with whom? And there were coalitions. And there were coalitions of the church with real estate developers, right? With politicians. And it really makes me think about how well CRABGRASS Catholicism fits within the turn in a lot of urban history scholarship towards thinking about power. So I think there's kind of an analogy here where there was, I think, a very robust sort of body of work thinking about suburbs and suburbanites through their lived experiences. A lot of the history is framed as history of consumption, how suburbanites bought things, how they kind of made meaning of like the refrigerators and their drive-in theaters. And then there was also the kind of institutional histories, the political histories. And CRABGRASS Catholicism, I think, joins them. And it's very much kind of part of the, I think, cutting edge of how historical scholarship is being done, in that you have the lived experiences of people, and that's always centered here. But those experiences are being defined and redefined in relation to the church and to the way that the church is functioning institutionally at any given moment. So I would say, if anything, one of the biggest takeaways for me is that the Catholic Church is what urban historiography needs to make sense of essentially those linkages between institutions and everyday people. I think this is a stunning example of how you could do that. I think, too, that this book really sits at the forefront of how scholars talk about politics and economics, political economy. And that especially, I think, comes to the forefront with me, how you talk about race and racism. So I really see CRABGRASS Catholicism as part of a recent wave of books, including In Levittown's Shadow by Tim Keogh, The Black Tax by Andrew Carl, recent work by Tom Segru, who's right now thinking about Latino suburbanization. He has this wonderful essay in a book called Metropolitan Latinidad, Transforming American Urban History, which is about Long Island. And I think namely why I see all of these books together as part of this really exciting cohort is that they link the ways that race worked to structural conditions and to kind of histories of very local places. So I think that, drawing on the example of Wyandanch in the Diocese of Rockville Center, we see in the book a pairing of how essentially the behavior of parishioners and the bold actions of we see like that, the behavior of parishioners and the bold actions of Father Andrew Connolly, with an explanation of why Wyandanch, a predominantly black section of Long Island, was also poor, why it had a different tax rate, why it was split by railroad tracks, how there was no industrial basis, and how it being unincorporated meant that it was subject to the whims of a town board. Like many of its counterparts across the country, that board rarely put a premium on developing infrastructure or providing adequate services. So essentially, this is not just a spatial story, but we also see the way that those relationships are racialized, and we see the way that they are kind of occurring at multiple scales between residents in government, residents in institution, and it's within that context that we see the relationships between residents and the church. And so I think that that's what also makes this very crucial, and why I think that it's so much in dialogue with the most recent and important works on the histories of cities and suburbs. We see here that suburbs are also not necessarily all suburban, in a sense, right, as well. Wyandanch was part of what scholars call a hidden history of suburban poverty in places like Long Island, and that shaped the inadequate political responses to inclusion. And the fact that, and this kind of stood out to me, is a stat that you mentioned, Father Stevens, that 1/3 of Long Island rentals were illegal rooms in basements and attics. And I think that also then should make us consider even more kind of how important that is in terms of how it affects religious practice, parish boundaries, church attendance, and community. So to turn to kind of some new directions and then questions. So I think one trend that I see in a lot of scholarship about suburbs right now is how do you kind of think about suburbs more transnationally and more globally? And I very selfishly bring this up because it's also what I'm working on now, so it is heavily on my mind. But where else can we apply the methods, the types of archival research, the types of historical actors who are in this book? How can we kind of think about ways in which this can be more of even a global story, a transnational story? Where else do we look for suburbs? And so I want to kind of briefly, by way of me mentioning some possibilities, I'm currently working on a book that includes Levittown, Puerto Rico, and where the first church building in Levittown, Puerto Rico, was not Catholic, but Lutheran. But Catholic services were held on porches by a visiting priest and laity, and it was very much like the home visits, except they were outdoors, because so much of the Levittown, Puerto Rico houses mixed indoor and outdoor spaces, because it was a bit of a different type of suburb, different type of design, different weather. And so home visits were incredibly visible and drew crowds from all over the block. That is what the first Catholic services looked like in Levittown, Puerto Rico. But the church was a bit behind in getting funding for the actual buildings, right? And that's why Lutheran Church was the first church building to actually go up in the area. So the Catholic majority in Levittown, Puerto Rico, also struggled potentially then with the pace of institution building for a planned community that grew incredibly quickly, from nothing to thousands of residents within just a couple of years. How then does suburban form kind of give these kind of new ways to think about improvisation, improvised community, improvised kind of insertions of institutions into new spaces? I think that there's a place for that, especially given that the majority of residents in Levittown, Puerto Rico were returning migrants who had lived in places like New York, like Philadelphia, Long Island, amongst that. So I want to turn now to some questions that I'm just going to throw out there, potentially for further discussion. Keeping on this kind of methodological point, I love that you use oral histories. And I wonder what can oral histories uniquely offer us in terms of suburban history and suburban religious history. Sometimes the archives of suburban places are very scattered or incomplete, often because they're unincorporated or widely dispersed, right? Or not considered important or considered everyday places. So what can that uniquely offer us? And I'd love to hear about any kind of challenges you potentially face too in doing those oral histories. In terms of the changing nature of the suburbs, I'm kind of curious about in US suburbs. US suburbs are becoming denser. They're becoming more socioeconomically diverse. They're becoming more diverse in terms of immigrant group as well as languages spoken, in terms of types of housing. It's very common now to find apartment buildings, right, being constructed in suburbs. And part of that's due to just a larger kind of global affordability crisis. It's really hard for people to afford to live in a lot of US cities. So people go further and further and further into the periphery. So in some ways, suburbs now look a little more like cities than they used to, right? So I kind of wonder, do you see in any ways a pendulum swinging back towards the possibilities of recreating what you described as the urban parish in the suburbs? And what is the future of the kind of urban periphery in terms of the types of religious practice and community you see as possible that might be different from what was possible in the 1960s, 70s, 80s? And finally, you end the book with a really powerful line about kind of how, about the legacy of the story, about how the problems and issues that the church is grappling with today, you can really see a lot of the origins of that in suburbanization in the mid-20th century. So I want to return to the drive-in theater. You essentially have a stat in your epilogue about disaffiliation, and you use 2020 as a data point. So is there an analogy between the drive-in theater and something like the impact of pandemic-era remote services, right? What can something like that drive-in theater tell us about fragmentation today caused by things like remote work, like Zoom meetings? And do we see in this suburban story not just the origins of major issues with which the church is grappling, but do we also see the seeds of action for potentially thinking about like what, how the church can approach that kind of rapidly changing, in some ways, somewhat digital landscape? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to start first by saying thank you to Madonna, Shane, David, Darren, and the Cushwa family. Unlike many of you here, I was not educated at Notre Dame, but sometimes it feels like I was, because especially my most recent book, I feel like got a big lift here from the center. And I'll also start by saying I think the reason I was invited this time is that they needed someone who was not from the greater New York City or Rockville. My own upbringing was in the very far-flung outpost of New Jersey. So thank you. Next, I'd like to address Father Koeth by saying bravo and thank you. CRABGRASS Catholicism, it's important because it's thorough, it's creative, in many ways you've already just heard about as a contribution to 20th century American Catholicism and urban and metropolitan history. This examination of the church and suburbanization in 2 Long Island counties reveals and probes so much about lived religion, church organization, and politics of the post-World War II period. One of the things that I really appreciate about it is it's both a bird's eye and a granular vision of religious spaces, balanced so well throughout the chapters. In many ways, the study is a geographical mapping of the golden days. And I'm saying that in quotation marks or parentheses because Koeth makes abundantly clear that the experience surely felt exciting at the time, but also hurried and chaotic, with plenty of tensions and disappointments to accompany the vigor and successes of the church in these years. So I'm going to do my best not to talk too much about myself. That's a struggle because, like others here, I feel like I lived a version of this in southern New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia. As a daughter of the suburbs, born in the later decades of this book, I came away thinking often of my grandparents, their experiences of raising children, and in the case of my parents growing up in this world. First, let me discuss what I regard as one of the most important contributions of Koeth's study and why it helps us understand suburbanization and religion well beyond the boundaries of Nassau and Suffolk counties, or should I say, the Diocese of Rockville Center. That county-parish pivot is, in fact, the story of these places, or rather, the geographical spaces within those boundaries that tells this story and reveals so much: the mapping, the planning, the building, the administration of those places. That is the heart of this investigation, as is the ways that people built lives and changed the church within these spaces. In this way, I think it is useful to put crabgrass Catholicism in conversation with other important monographs that have documented how freeways, residential developments, and shopping malls yielded new formations. Others have documented storefront churches, home worship, youth group purity culture, etc. It was funny, it was very generous of you to mention me in your introduction as having called for work in this area, because at the time that I expressed that, I was thinking of myself as one of the people who missed the boat on religion with my own study of conservatism. But plenty of others did do that work, and much of that work was supported by the Cushwa Center right here. So, for example, Dochuk's book, Bible Belt to Sunbelt, Darren Grem's Blessings of Business, Bethany Morton's book on God and Walmart. You're also catching a theme here, which is that the story of capitalism and corporation, but also how much of that work of suburban religion is driven by the study of evangelical conservatism. Crabgrass Catholicism, of course, also builds on another body of work started decades ago on American cities that brought church history into the center of that. The Immigrant Church is documented by J. Dolan, Parish Boundaries by John McGreevy, The New Nuns, documented by Amy Collinger, just to name a few. So there's one word especially repeated here, and we may talk about this, that I noticed: ecclesial. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, ecclesial is an adjective defined as of or pertaining to the church, and it's synonymous with ecclesiastical. It frequently relates to the internal, spiritual, or community life of a Christian church. So in my observation, as someone who has come, let's say, late to Catholic studies, it was not the origins of my own research, I have encountered that word, or ecclesiastical, to mean something else as I encountered it, an adjective that refers to the managing and administration of the Catholic Church. It usually refers to clergy, the work and pastoring or ministering within a Catholic context. At least that's the way I've seen it used. I actually see that as a great strength of this book, that work. Crabgrass Catholicism takes seriously the work of buyers, developers, planners. And this is mostly priests, but also nuns. And the most important person here is Walter Kellenberg, the Bishop of Rockville Center. Unlike let's say, the migrations taken by Darren Dochuk's subjects, Catholics did not leave Brooklyn and Queens feeling called to plant new churches in Hempstead. They left for those places with confidence that there would be churches and parochial schools either waiting for them or priests and nuns eager to build them. It's I feel like a very different experience between these two religious communities of religions in suburbs. So in that respect, Koeth's world here feels more like an extended rapid response mission than, to borrow Dochuk's, errand into the wilderness. Also, with its attention to structures, both built and organizational, we see how the Catholic Church has a different relationship to suburbanization than other Christian denominations or Jewish institutions that were establishing themselves in this period. Priests and bishops operated much like city officials who govern territories, whether from, the Holy See or Manhattan. You can see these boundaries clearly in the fantastic maps provided by Koeth and in the very detailed history of this book, the deep research. Men and women religious are not the only subjects. Koeth is attentive to the work of lay Catholics, as you just heard. They were more typically native-born, educated, and middle class than their predecessors in cities. And they expected to have a voice in parish affairs. I like how you described that. This attitude was fueled not only by economic success and entrance into mainstream American society, but also by Vatican II, which created new roles for the lay apostolate. So at this point, I think it's worth asking then, where do we go from here? How do we take this work and continue to build? What can we do with this rich and detailed analysis, this comprehensive record of institutional growth? CRABGRASS Catholicism tells us, though not directly in the epilogue. Those 5 pages pack a punch with their discussion of disaffiliation and scandal. Reading that final section felt like, as I was turning those pages, I was peeling back a cover to reveal another layer underneath. Koeth notes how the story of sexual abuse by religious is not a new development to our discussion so much as revelations about what was happening during the period of his own study. I see this as a signal for others to dig deeper, not asking how these things happened at the same time, but what do they have to do with each other? It would be wrong to say that the history of sexual abuse in the church was caused or even correlated with suburbanization, since it took place in urban and rural parishes and in other countries as well. But it is worth asking how the work of planning, administering, expanding, and funding the churches created spaces in which these crimes happened. Could it be that the work of this rapid response was so pressing that it invited builders to look away? That the work of relocating priests, for example, was more than denial. It might be the kind of decision made by people forced to spend so much time looking at maps and budgets as they did writing homilies, developing liturgy, and visiting sick parishioners. I also can't help but think about, not unconnected to the abuses perpetuated by Cesar Chavez, who was called a loyal son of the church by Pope Paul VI in 1974. Okay, we're in the same time period. So much to reckon with here. A patriarchy that at once created the opportunities to serve the poor, as this movement for migrant workers did. In fact, Chavez and his movement became a model for how to serve the poor in this country, drawing people from urban and suburban centers alike to pay attention to rural America. But it also was part of what created opportunities to rape Dolores Huerta and girls in this community, urban, suburban, and rural parishes. I see other opportunities in this work for future scholars, especially in the chapters on the lay apostolate and politics. Koeth talks, for example, about the promotion of at-home family ministry and even at-home religious retreats. We see many examples of improvising and kind of rolling with these improvisations. Okay, you already went at length about my favorite drive-in ministry, but I can't help but wonder how these experiences shape the ways that Catholics viewed their own role in the church and society as religious subjects. If we take the poet housewife mentioned by Koeth, Phyllis McGinley, as an example, how might the words and actions of laywomen help us to understand the changing subjectivity of Catholic mothers? How might the education and financial success that they enjoy shape the ways they related to the church and did the work of the church? Some of this has been done. I'm thinking of Stacy Taranto's book, Kitchen Table Politics, about Ellen McCormack, mentioned by Father Koeth. First, Bronx, Queens, and then Marymount housewife in Nassau County who ran on the Right to Life ticket for president. How did post-War II generations see and narrate their experiences as Catholics, their memories, and how did that narration shape the institutions of religious life around them? I was raised, for example, of stories from my parents' youth in parochial schools, stories full of drama. Public school life, my school life, seemed boring compared to my father's childhood in working-class Camden, New Jersey. The stories of nuns who rapped on his knuckles or forced him to stand in the back of the church in the posture of Christ on the cross. I'm joking around here, and the stories of the nuns who raided the pool house where he would sneak off and smoke with his friends and secretly hang out. We were told these stories to highlight and explain why they sent us to public schools, why CCD was better for us, even it felt like Catholic education light, as we sat among the felt banners made by our friends who went to school every morning in uniform. Moving to the suburbs was as much about adopting what my parents saw as a more modern version, a civilized and humane version of ethnic Irish and German churches as they grew up. I'm going to conclude my remarks by returning to the metaphor I feel like I've already overused today and saying that Father Koeth has broken important ground here. In addition to this robust study of Long Island, CRABGRASS Catholicism has introduced new ways to understand the church as a changing configuration of spaces where lived religion can be observed and appreciated. It is a model, especially for how detailed and thorough scholarship can be and should be applied elsewhere in some of the places mentioned and in other contexts and as a basis for asking new questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I want to begin, as others have, by thanking Darren and David and Shane and Madonna for inviting me to have CRABGRASS Catholicism be the focus of today's seminar, and the Cushwa Center and the Cushwa family, too. I've said in a number of settings that this really has been an intellectual home for me for many, many years, going back to my undergrad days here at the university. And it was out of a Cushwa conference that a collection of essays came out that contained an essay by Tom Segru that launched this study of suburbs. Tom had written that we just knew all too little about them. And I said, ooh, there's a dissertation topic for you. And off I went. I want to thank, too, my Holy Cross confreres and colleagues from the department who are present. I see some former students and some residents of Stanford Hall. I'd like to thank them for being here. And most of all, Sean and Paige and Michelle for doing me the honor of having read the book so carefully and so incisively. Really wonderful questions and comments, and I won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll have a couple of thoughts. One, I'm really grateful Whenever the book is talked about, when people say it resonates with their experience of having grown up or heard from their parents who grew up in these suburbs, it makes me feel like, again, I did something right. I captured something of the lived experience, and several of you mentioned that kind of a space that feels lived in, I think was one of the phrases that was used, and I really appreciate that. You know, Sean highlighted, he said it really begins to fill this gap, and I agree, and thank you, but I want to say begins is the key word. I don't imagine that this is the last word that should be said about Catholic suburbs. I don't want this to be just a cop-out, but I like to highlight that this is the first book-length study of Catholic suburbanization since Andrew Greeley wrote his study of Catholic suburbs in 1959, right? So there's plenty of work to be done, and I don't at all, I'm not at all insulted by the thought that, oh, it's not all here, there's more to do. One of the questions that Sean asked along these lines is other suburban dioceses. Would the story be the same if we were in Joliet, Illinois, as a suburban diocese? Or would this story be the same if we were in the suburbs of St. Louis or Chicago that remain part of the archdiocese, that were not split off to be their own diocese? Or would this story be the same if we are in suburban areas of Southern California or Texas or Florida? My suspicion is two things. One, no, it's not entirely the same. There are going to be nuances and differences, especially in those two areas that I've just mentioned. One, when the the suburb is still part of an archdiocese, that changes funding, that changes priestly assignments, it changes all sorts of things. And it's certainly then going to be true in the Sun Belt South. Those suburbs develop differently and at a different time. And so yes, there's going to be nuances and differences. My other suspicion, though, is that my hope too, is that I wrote the book in a way that highlighted things that would be pretty similar, that there'd be some threads of connection. The way that the laity and the relationship to the clergy changed, the way that funding mechanisms, et cetera, right? Catholics shaping suburbs. Yeah, you mentioned John McGreevy, Sean. That's one of the things that John always asks and pushes, and I think there's much more to be done. I think I was much more on the side of the way that suburbs shape the church, and I think we need to do more. I wish that Cardinal Spellman hadn't been so coy, because he met regularly with Robert Moses. And I know that because they have these little notes between them. Great to see you, Bob. Look forward to next week. Thanks for that phone call we had last week. We'll move on that matter. Purposely not saying what the matter was, right? I'd love to know more about that. And I didn't look at developers' archives, right? And these, Paige would have me do that too, I'm sure, right? To look at the developers and what about their records and what were they thinking and planning, right? There's lots more to be done there. Sean mentions too a kind of new era. I'm glad that he said that. In a certain sense, that was my point. One of the points of writing the book was to say, Jay Dolan, our esteemed founder, talked about an immigrant era, and that this is an attempt to say the next era was something more than just the Vatican II era. It preceded the council. It has outlived, so to speak, the people who were in the generation of the council, lived the experience of the council. Are we now in a new moment, burgeoning, a new immigrant church? Maybe, but as Michelle mentioned, or several of you mentioned, I think, a lot of these immigrants are living for the first time in the United States, not in a city and not in an ethnic neighborhood, but in a suburb. So maybe the suburban era hasn't ended and it will kind of merge with this new immigrant era. The Wyandanch story, I think, is really important, and I wish I had been able to do more. It raises a point of that race gets its own chapter, race and ethnicity gets its own chapter in the book, but gender doesn't. And Michelle, you mentioned the significance of women, right? And they certainly could have, gender could have had its own chapter. That's something that we could talk more about in the Q&A, why not, and what would have been different if it had been separated out in that way. Oral history, just real quickly, in terms of sources, I was lucky to go into the archives of the Diocese of Rockville Center and not only find a really excellent diocesan newspaper that I read through 30 years worth of their weekly editions, but also to find a series of oral histories that were conducted by the diocese. So I conducted some oral interviews with founding era parishioners, but I'm not trained in oral history methods, and that would not have been enough. But that the diocese itself had hired people to do oral histories at certain anniversaries of the diocese and of the seminary of the diocese was really, really helpful. Most of the time, it was priests, though some laity who were involved in leading diocesan institutions or had been on diocesan committees. The priests, one of the oral histories was because of the anniversary of the seminary. The focus was on how was your formation for a particular church different from your living of priestly ministry in a post-Vatican II church? How had that? And that was where I got so much about, well, it wasn't just about the council, it was about, and they talked more about suburbs. They talked more about the building and the developing and the expansion. So I was able to really focus on that. Maybe I'll finish with, I love this ecclesial question. I want to talk more about that, but maybe legacy and epilogue. The epilogue had 4 different versions, and one of them centered on sexual abuse completely. And we ultimately decided, the editors and I, that that's not what I had researched. I had not really found any evidence of abuse or of cover-up in the archives. I'm not expert in this particular topic, though that expertise is only just now being developed by scholars. We've got a lot more work to do. So we didn't foreground it in the way that I had in one of the versions of the epilogue, but a lot more needs to be done, obviously. It is the dark cloud that now hangs over this era. Even all these years later, the high point of, as I say in the epilogue, the high point of cases really is squarely in this late 50s, 60s, early 70s. Whether or not suburbanization is a cause of some of this, as you say, not all of it, because it happened too in urban spaces, it happened in rural spaces, but the built environments and the way that all of a sudden the church was in the home, as Sean pointed out, and what does that do with clergy and access to young people, and or the assignment of priests. I say in the book that the Diocese of Rockville Center was broken off of Brooklyn and Queens, and the way that priests were assigned to this new diocese is that they were frozen in place. If you were in Nassau and Suffolk on January 1st, 1957, you're now a priest of Rockville Center. Well, the problem with that is that even the priests of the diocese said in these oral interviews, well, Nassau and Suffolk was where the Bishop of Brooklyn had always put his problem priests, in the boonies, right, away from the... Now, problem priests were sometimes alcoholics, or they were pastors who just couldn't hack it in a big parish. They couldn't raise any money, they couldn't whatever. But I don't think we have to read between the lines too much to say some of them had probably been accused of something, right? Or potentially, at least. So I think, again, this space, the suburban space may be connected to this in some way. And then maybe a little bit more positively. Has the church maybe gotten better at planting itself or building itself in a suburban context? I've been interested, the reception of the book has perhaps been most fervent in what I might describe loosely as kind of Catholic new urbanism. A group that probably is more critical of suburbs than I am. So when I try to defend it a little bit, I say, I think the Catholic Church in the suburbs of Dallas-Fort Worth and Atlanta and Phoenix is doing pretty well. So did we learn something through this era? We had to get our footing for a while. There was improvisation, there was experimentation, maybe. I see Dr. Jack Young here. Did we learn something from evangelicals, right? Are the suburban Catholic churches in those areas doing better because they're in the Sun Belt South and they've had more exposure to a religious group that by all measures won the suburbs, right? maybe that's another possibility. But I do think that I may be more hopeful than not that after an era of drive-in movie theater churches, and now in an era of post-COVID work from home, the church does actually have something to say about how we can build community in person, and that may actually be more attractive to young people, especially today, than ever before, and more necessary than ever before. So, if not optimistic, at least with optimism, the opportunity and the chance, right? So again, thanks to all my commentators and to all of you for being here today. And I know we're going to take a break now for coffee. I look forward to questions.
For sure. Let's take 15 minutes, bring your questions and even testimonials.